Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture where we'll talk about offensive neorealism. I think I'm just calling it offensive realism on the slides, but we should really consider it as sort of it's an answer to Waltz in one way. And so if you think about Ken Waltz as a neorealist, then the answer to Waltz is from Mearsheimer, and it's largely agrees with Waltz, right? It largely agrees with Waltz in terms of realism, in terms of power, in terms of states being in a self-help system, being afraid. It agrees with Waltz that we should concentrate on the systemic level. So it has a lot in common with Waltz. If you've already read the Ashley piece, you've seen some of the criticisms of Waltz. Almost any criticism you make of Waltz, you can probably make of Mearsheimer too. So I'm calling it offensive realism, but I think if I was being a little bit more specific, I'd probably call it offensive neorealism. But of course, neorealism is also realism. And Mearsheimer also has something that he wants to say to Morgenthau as well. And so bear these things in mind as we go through the slides. That Mearsheimer is talking to Waltz and he's talking to Morgenthau, both of whom we've discussed in lectures like this. Okay, now one thing I should say that is Mearsheimer is writing in a much more recent time, than even than Waltz, right? But certainly than Morgenthau. So Morgenthau is right, 1948. Waltz, I think we're reading from 1979. Mearsheimer is in the 21st century. All right. So I mean, this is sort of the proof that realism is certainly still around. Neorealism is certainly still around. It's still influential in the study of international politics today. Even if it was maybe 20 years ago, but in the sort of lifetime of an academic discipline, 20 years is really not very much at all. All right. Okay, so I'm going to bring up the slides now. All right. So here we are. Let's do it. That's my first slide, actually. Yeah. Beyond the title. Here's the title: Offensive Realism. Like I said, we're almost entirely focused on Mearsheimer here, and again, so when we talk about Waltz, we talked about defensive neorealism, but we actually only talk about neorealism. It doesn't become defensive neorealism until Mearsheimer comes up with this idea of offensive neorealism. And so we'll see. Waltz is focused on fear. States are afraid, and so they have to defend themselves. They're in a self-help system. Nobody else is going to help them. They've got to help themselves, and they've got to defend themselves. They want to survive. Okay. So offensive realism then, or offensive neorealism, is you can probably guess it's going to take the opposite tack, right? That states don't need to defend themselves, but they actually need to attack other states. Now, let's go back a bit. So before we get to that, the question that Mearsheimer is dealing with is this question: why hasn't there been any war? Because if we're in a state of war of all against all, and if power is all states are seeking, if all states are all seeking power, and if we're worried about relative gains, remember, right, that if one state gets a little bit of power, the other states have got to address that. If that's the case, well, why isn't there more war? We haven't really seen war. Now, let's talk about a little bit. We're going to go into something called great powers in a second, right? But we've already sort of introduced the concept in earlier lectures, because of course we've sort of said, well, who participates in international politics in it? And we've said, well, not all states participate, right? Only some. And we've sort of named some states in the past. We said, the United States, certainly China, right? Maybe Russia, India, probably, maybe Britain, France, Germany. Probably not too many more states than that. South Korea, perhaps Brazil. North Korea, we're starting to get a little bit short probably on states now that are really big players in the game. What we've said up to now, how we've described sort of big players, what we'll do now is, in this lecture, is actually define them as great powers, and we'll talk about what great powers, who they are maybe, or what they are and what they try to do. in terms of offensive neorealism, in terms of being offensive. But the problem that realism has, and this is a problem that they've had, for a long time now, and the problem probably still goes on today, is if we have this war of all against all, if we have competition, if we have self-help, if we have concern with relative gain, if we have fear of each other, they all have offensive capabilities. Why isn't there more war? There hasn't really been a great power war, right? A war between great powers. There hasn't really been one since the Second World War. Can you think of one? Can you think of a war where you had direct confrontation, direct combatants who were either, again, maybe the Soviet Union, because we can go back, again, going back to the Second World War. So we had the Soviet Union and the United States never fought a war directly against one another. We've had the rise of China. We still haven't had a war between China and the United States, or China and Russia, for example. We've had a little bit of a war every now and again between China and India, fairly small level, small scale conflicts between the two. We've also had them maybe, again, on the same sort of smaller scale between Pakistan and India, but those wars, first, have been fairly measured, but also, is Pakistan really a great power? Well, maybe not by most of the measurements that we're going to use later on in this course. So, you're really struggling. Of course, you've had the United States involved in wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, of course. But you can't, however powerful Iraq were thought to have been, I don't think anybody ever thought they were a great power. And Afghanistan certainly can't be considered a great power. You had the Bosnian wars, you had the United States sort of taking on Serbia, but again, Serbia's not a great power. So you haven't really had, why hasn't there been any great power war? And this is what Mearsheimer, that's what he wants to explain in some ways, because he has to save realism in some ways, because people are being turned off from realism because they're saying, well, realism would predict many more wars. The other thing that we'll talk about when we talk about liberalism, that's an attempt to sort of move past realism a little bit. As you'll see, the Cold War ended, right? The Cold War just sort of folded in on itself, and the Soviets sort of gave up. Like, what was that about? Like, where's your self-help system now? If one side can just, so this is a big question that sort of gives rise to Mearsheimer's book. Oh, I haven't explained his argument yet, but so let me do that before we move on too much further. I've put the picture there to give you a clue, but this might be the reason why there's no war. The United States has bases all over the world. And this is what Mearsheimer says. He says, look, sure, there's been no great power war, but there's still been security competition. Throughout the Cold War, although it was a Cold War, both sides acted as though the other side was a real threat, and they acted as though they were in a security competition with one another. Like, maybe not a war in terms of fighting, but they were both, both superpowers were building up their arms because they both expected war between them. And remember, right? Remember that for the war of all against all that we're talking about, right? And that's a phrase from Thomas Hobbes. And remember that Thomas Hobbes talks about the cloudy sky. He says, right, it's not raining right now, but I look out my window and I can see, okay, it's not raining. But when I'm deciding whether or not to take my umbrella, I'm not just looking at are there raindrops on my window right now. No, it's look at those clouds, right? It could rain at any moment. And so Mearsheimer's argument is that all during the Cold War, there could have been a war at any moment. And both sides saw this, right? And both sides prepared for that. I do want to, I think this has some relevance to what we're going to talk about in a second when we cover Mearsheimer's theory. Look at the bases. These are American bases that are all around the world. How many bases do they have in particular regions? And you can see that they are concentrated. This is US overseas bases. You can see they're concentrated in two main places. Like, look at this, Europe, sort of Germany, right, is going to be Italy Italy and Germany, massive amounts of a big US presence there. They've been drawing down their presence recently. And it's probably not, if you're a realist, you would definitely say, it's not a coincidence that as the United States sort of draws down its presence in Europe, that the Russians are becoming a little bit more assertive in Europe. So that's something to consider. So Europe and then Japan. Big forces in Japan and Korea here, right? Japan and South Korea in the Pacific, basically. So two big concentrations of American troops. And of course, there's American troops elsewhere, but look at these, sort of lily pads around Africa, maybe refueling stations, that sort of thing. Around this was common, especially even in the British Empire, right, to have these sort of stops around the Indian Ocean so that you can stop and refuel and get supplies, things like that. It's important to be able to move your forces around the world. Power projection, Mearsheimer talks quite a lot about that. But for the most part, we're looking at big forces in Japan, South Korea, right, so East Asia, and then Europe. So Mearsheimer says this. He looks back at Morgenthau and he looks back at Waltz, and he says these guys are realists. I'm a realist too, but the difference between us is this: Morgenthau, he thinks that states seek power because it's some sort of biological drive, right? It's a psycho-biological or biopsychological, I think he says, drive. It's the same thing, right? Biology and psychology makes us want to seek power. That's how Morgenthau explains the security dilemma, the competition that exists for power. Waltz says it's not that. It's states have to survive, and they're in a self-help system. So the only way to survive is to seek power, right? And if you don't survive, you can't do anything. So that's what Waltz says. And again, this is Mearsheimer explaining these two guys. Mearsheimer comes along and says, no. It's that. Well, he's still. What is it then? Sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit, because the thing is, he's not disagreeing with Waltz. He's still a neo-realist. He still feels like we're in a self-help system and we're afraid. But he says Waltz might think that they just want to survive. So he thinks, well, maybe they can have enough power and then they'll survive. So, defensive neo-realism, as espoused by Waltz, like, it might predict that once you get to a particular level of power, that you've sort of got enough, right? Maybe if you're France right now, maybe you don't really expect an invasion from anyone, right? Or Britain, for example, right? Maybe you can get to a point, or even China, right? Maybe you can get to a particular point where you feel like, yeah, we're safe. Nobody's going to come and invade us. The United States probably feels fairly safe, right? Lots of us, at least inside the United States, would say, yeah, we've got enough power. Like, we don't have to worry about being invaded by any other country in the world, or even a group of countries would find it very difficult. And we might feel quite safe about that. Mearsheimer says, no, that we never get to that point. We never get to that point. But I'm going a little bit ahead of myself. So keep that in our mind, but let's go on, because that's going to be the central aspect of Mearsheimer's argument. But he says, look, states are afraid, same as defensive neorealism. States are afraid. There's an absence of a central authority to protect states from one another, right? Which is what we said before. There's anarchy. States, well, and this is something that he brings in that's a little bit unique, a bit of a unique focus. States always have some offensive capability. I don't know, it might not be that unique. Waltz probably said that as well. There's no certainty about other states' intentions, right? So, it might be that Russia, right, might tell us, oh, we're not going to invade Ukraine. And we might not really want them to invade Ukraine. We might want to believe that they're not going to do it, but we don't know. If you're a realist, we just don't know. You can't just take their word for it, right? You can't just take the word for it. So we don't have any certainty about what their intentions are. Their intentions may be to invade Ukraine, but there might not be. That might not be their intention at all. I personally think that their intentions are just sort of, and maybe by the time you're watching this, we'll know for sure. and maybe I'll be wrong, but my expectation is that that's not really what they're trying to do. This is a sort of a bargaining, a negotiating tactic, right? It's the threat of force, right? It's politics, as Morgan Thau said, right? It's probably not in their interest to actually fight a war. We'll talk much more about that as well with Mearsheimer. It's probably not in Russia's interest to actually fight a war, even with Ukraine, because although they would win, it would weaken them. I don't think it's their intentions, and they're saying that it's not their intentions. But even if I don't think that that's their intentions, we can't know. There's no certainty about that. Survival is still the primary goal, and great powers are rational actors, right? And so when we look at Russia, they're a rational actor. Sometimes you might hear, like in the news, or you might hear people saying things like, "Oh, Iran, we can't let them get a nuclear weapon because they're irrational. They'll do things that are, just that are crazy, right? They've threatened to wipe Israel off the map," which they have, of course, threatened that. But a realist will say, yeah, there's all sorts of rhetoric, right? They might say all these things about their intentions and about what they're going to do. But ultimately, what they will do is they'll act rationally. And rationally here means that they'll act to increase their power. A nuclear attack against Israel from Iran, that's not rational, right? That's not behaving rational. Iran, they would not last 2 minutes after that, right? So realists will say they're not going to do that. That's very unlikely, like incredibly unlikely. All right, because it's irrational, and powers are rational. I think states generally are rational actors, but particularly great powers, which is who Mearsheimer is probably particularly interested in at this point. All right. I think I included this to say, look, it's not that states are malicious or anything like that. They're only just behaving rationally. And this is Bismarck, so this is going back a little bit now, 1850, something like that. Where he says, look, I've got sort of a picture of Poland here, and Poland's in a very precarious position, right? Because they've always been sort of positioned between these two great powers, Russia and then Prussia, and later on Germany, right? So, and on this map they've also got the Austro-Hungarian Empire right there, and they've got the Ottoman Empire. So difficult geographic position. And Bismarck says, look, I have every sympathy for their situation, right? Their position in Europe. But if we wish to survive, we have no choice but to wipe them out. It's about survival. So survival is about wiping out your opponents. Right? It's them or us. If there's going to be a Germany, there can't be a Poland. Right? Similarly, probably if there's going to be a Russia, right, there can't be a Ukraine. At least there can't be a Ukraine that's in NATO. And so we might have to wipe them out. And again, it's about rational acting. It's about acting rationally. It's not about being nice or kind. And remember, going back to morality, right? For realists, morality, it's different for states. Right? We can't sacrifice our own safety, the safety of our states. We can't do that. It's immoral to do that, because what we're really doing is sacrificing our whole population, which they're not making that decision. Right? They don't want to die, or they don't want to, sort of death of sort of physical death, but then there's also like sort of the death of the state, and that's another. Both of those things are sort of intertwined in some ways, but difficult to. Sometimes difficult to define, right? I mean, the other thing, I'm sort of focused on Russia quite a bit right now, I suppose, but Putin said something the other day that what was it? So something like the breakup of the Soviet Union was the end of historic Russia, or something like that, right? That state died. Russia, the Russian Empire, died at the breakup of the Soviet Union, right? And so the implication is that, well, this seems to suggest that he's, might be threatening Ukraine, right? Because he might want to resurrect the old Russia. Anyway, here we are. So, but if he does do that, right, offensive realists might predict that because they'll attack in order to be able to survive. Okay, so what is a great power then? This should be a fairly quick slide, I promise. And the question is this: like, what's a great power? The answer is, this is Mearsheimer's answer, by the way. We'll talk about this when we talk about power as well, and we'll measure it in different ways. But yeah, every theorist has to have some sort of definition, or he has to at least address the issue, because we have that very sort of central, or very fundamental, I should say, maybe not central, but fundamental, basic assumption in realism that not all states are really playing the game, and so which states are playing the game, and so we can figure this out. It's that they must have the military assets. For Mearsheimer, it's all about the military. All right, we'll talk more about that when we talk about power. So they must have the military assets to put up a serious fight against the most powerful state in the world. They don't have to be able to beat the most powerful state in the world, but they have to be able to seriously weaken the dominant state. So those two things are the main thing. The third one is sort of they also have to have nuclear weapons and formidable conventional forces, unless it's a nuclear hegemon. We'll talk about nuclear hegemony another time. I won't focus on that now, but do keep that in your mind. Maybe write in your notes if you're keeping any, like, what's a nuclear hegemon? And that'll be answered in a future lecture, I think. And if it's not, email me. All right, so sort of applying this, I guess, to the world that we live in. China, right? China, I would say right now, could not defeat the United States in a straight war. It couldn't overwhelm the United States. It couldn't, I'm not expecting, I don't think any of us would expect, even given we have a war with them, right? Because that's one thing to expect a war, but even if we have the war, we probably wouldn't expect a war where China's conquering the United States. It doesn't have to have some sort of outright win. It doesn't have to win in the way that the United States beat Germany and Japan in World War II. It doesn't have to do that to be a great power. But it has to be able to, if it fights, it has to be a serious fight. So Iraq, for example, that's not a serious fight. Iraq was never going to win. They didn't seriously weaken the United States. Not in the war, at least. Maybe the sort of attrition, the war of attrition that went on for years and years and years and years afterwards with the insurgency. That's a different kettle of fish, really, right? Realists are not usually talking about insurgencies. They're usually talking about state versus the state. Right? If you remember, if you've read Ashley's critique, you'll see that neorealists in particular are state-centric. That's they only really care about the state. And Iraq was never the war between Iraq and the United States didn't seriously weaken the United States. Okay, and the war between the United States and Serbia also, right, didn't seriously weaken the United States. All right. So those countries are probably not great powers. Right. Also, Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons, and so they can't be a great power. Neither did Serbia have nuclear weapons, and so can't be a great power either. That's a quick one to, if you want to boot anybody out of the club straight away, that's the first place to go, probably this bottom one, because they either have nuclear weapons or they don't. So North Korea, they have them. France has them, Britain has them, Russia has them, Israel has them, China has them. That's 6. Did I say the United States has them? Oh, and India and Pakistan. All right, so I think I covered pretty much everybody that has them now. There's a couple of interesting cases where Ukraine used to have them. They had a good stockpile on their territory when they left the Soviet Union that maybe would have fallen into their hands, but they decided to give them to the Russians, which seems at this point like not a great decision to have made. That was that. South Africa also gave them up. Having had them, they gave them up. I can't remember if there was another country that gave them up. Trying to remember now. But anyway, South Africa and Ukraine gave them up. Anyway, so they have to have them, as well as they have to have serious conventional forces, right? Conventional forces here just means non-nuclear forces. Army, Navy, Air Force, normal fighters, bombers, tanks, aircraft carriers, that sort of thing. Right? Attack submarines. And so this is the question that probably arose before on a previous slide, but why do they continue to pursue relative power? Remember, realism, it's all about relative power. And so, the United States today, like it has enough power, I would say, personally. I don't think anyone, it has enough power to keep it secure. There's nobody that, tomorrow is going to invade the United States and take it over. That's impossible, I would say. Even a combination, a group of countries, even Russia and China together, I would say, wouldn't have a chance. Even if somehow Russia and China joined with those European powers, the Germans, the French, the British, and the Japanese. Anyway. I don't want to gloat or anything, right? But I'm pretty sure that the United States right now is not going to it's not going to be conquered. Its security is pretty safe. Okay. So that's what if they had enough power to survive? Well, Mearsheimer answers that. He says, look, they can't know if they have enough power until they are the hegemon. And being the hegemon means that you're the only great power. Remember the definition of the great power, right? What's a great power? It's that you've got military assets to put up a serious fight against the most powerful state in the world. So let's say so in order to be a hegemon for Mearsheimer, no other state can put up even a serious fight. They can't even put up a serious fight. It's not that they can't beat you, it's that they can't put up a serious fight. And that's probably, I would argue that's probably not the case. Right? I think the Chinese could put up a serious fight against the United States to the point where we wouldn't probably want to get into a war with them. I'd say Russia probably, depending on where the war was, we probably don't want to get in a war with them because we'd probably be severely stretched by that, or seriously stretched. We'd be weakened. So that's the one thing. So because there's other states out there that could give a serious fight to the United States is not the hegemon, therefore they don't have enough power. All right. They can't be sure that they'll have enough power 10 years down the road. So it's okay now that we're fine, let's say, but now we see that the North Koreans are developing those hypersonic missiles, right? They go much faster. It's harder to detect them via radar until they're very close. The intercontinental ballistic missiles, they're also very fast, but they have to go quite high up into the atmosphere so we can see them from a long way. But these new, not exactly new, but these missiles that are more recently being developed by, I think, the North Koreans and the Chinese, they can sort of give you more of a surprise because they don't go so high. And so the radar can't catch them as quickly. The point is that technology is changing. China is certainly spending more and more on its military than it used to. And that probably goes for other countries too, like India, for example. And so, right now we have enough power, but who knows in 10 years' time where we'll be. And so we can't get complacent. We have to keep pursuing our relative power. We have to keep ahead of the Chinese and India and Russia and probably Germany, France, and Britain as well. Because, and this is an important point that we maybe haven't discussed too much up to now, but a lot, like, for realists, it doesn't matter that Britain have historically been friends with the United States, at least since, the First World War. It doesn't matter, right, that the sort of France has historic ties to the United States as well. That doesn't matter for realists. A state is a state, and any state is a potential threat. We'll talk more about that when we talk about constructivism. So there's no status quo power. Status quo power is a power that just wants to keep everything as it is, keep this balance of power. There's no such thing. Everybody wants to increase their power. That's why it's offensive realism. It's offensive. We're always looking to be on the offensive. We're always looking to knock out our opponents and increase the distance between us and them. There are some sort of, Mearsheimer anticipates this objection, right? And the objection is, well, states won't go on the attack. They won't go on the offensive. The objection would be because, war is costly and like nobody wins out from war. Like, nobody benefits from war. There's actually an old Norman Angell argument as well, like where and not only Norman Angell, but he's one of the more famous proponents of it. Norman Angell would probably fit into what the realists call idealists, right? So Norman Angell came along like the 1920s, long time before Morgenthau, before the realists, and he says, look, there's no point in conquering territory anymore because there's no benefit in that. and so it doesn't pay, and it costs you to do it, right? It costs you in men, it costs you in money, and you don't get anything from it. So so it's pointless to go on the offensive. And Mearsheimer says, actually, no. In 63 wars between 1815 and 1980, the initiator of that war won 39 times, 60% of the time. So actually, there is some benefit to be getting from going on the offense for prosecuting an offensive war. You might win. All right, I want to just, this is the last slide, and I want to give it some time. This is probably the thing that Mearsheimer is most famous about, most famous for, and it's his explanation of sort of what states do to try and what they might offensively do, positively do in order to keep themselves safe. So remember, right, hegemons are status quo powers, but the thing is that there's no state can ever really be a world hegemon. Mearsheimer says this has never happened. There's never been one state that's a world hegemon where that's the only state that has, where no other state can even seriously fight that state. He says that's never happened, and he says it won't ever happen. The best a state can hope for is regional hegemony. Okay, so regional hegemony, what does that mean? He says, well, the United States is the only regional hegemon in history, but others have tried. And so in terms of what does it mean to be a regional hegemon? Well, this is what it means to be the United States. Think of this, right? So here's the United States in the Western Hemisphere, in North and South America, in Central America, in the Americas. Think of the United States in that region. Think of the other states, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. I'm not going to name them all, right? But there's some of the bigger ones, right? So, is there any of those countries other than, that's not the United States, any of those countries that could give the United States a serious fight? And the answer for Mearsheimer, and I think I have to agree, right? The answer is probably not, right? That no, Argentina is not much of a threat against the United States. If Argentina and the United States had a war, I would expect the United States to win fairly easily without suffering too much costs, and I would say the same for probably every other country, even Canada. There was a few years ago, I read something where there was this old document, every like 100 years or something, if the document's 100 years old, then the state will sort of declassify it or something like that. And there was a document declassified like 5 or 10 years ago now, where the Canadians had this plan to invade the United States. I think it's from like 1917 or something like that, like around the First World War, the very beginning of the 20th century. And, when I say they had a plan to invade the United States, it's not that they wanted to invade the United States, it's just that they had like a contingency plan right in place. What would we do if we had to invade the United States? And it's sort of a funny thing to think about, especially these days, because there's such a power mismatch that couldn't really happen. Right? I mean, it wouldn't even, I imagine they don't even have a contingency plan in place for that now, right? Because anyway, but incidentally, the plan was, so they had to go over the border. The people that were drawing up the plans had to pop over the border, go to a gas station in like Minnesota or something, buy a map from the gas station, go back and draw on the map, right? And the plan was to sort of invade the United States west of the Great Lakes, take up positions in sort of those north, the Dakotas, I think Minnesota, and down there, and then like hold the line and wait for the British to come and save them, which of course would be completely preposterous these days. It wouldn't have been a great plan back in those days probably, but these days obviously not at all. And it's in some ways I found it sort of comical because of the power mismatch between them these days. There's also, I don't know if you've ever seen the film, it's an older one now, but Canadian Bacon. If you look that up, that's sort of has this sort of similar plot, kind of, where the United States sort of propagandizes against the Canadians, and then a group of Americans sort of take it upon themselves to go and fight the Canadians. And of course, it's a comedy, right? And you've got John Candy in there and everything. Quite a funny film, I think. if you're Canadian or if you're American, you would probably find it quite funny. Yeah, anyway. But the fact that it's funny, the fact that I laughed when I heard about these plans to invade the United States that the Canadians had, and the fact that this sort of Canadian bacon film is quite funny, is that, you know, militarily Canada's not a threat. It's not a match for the United States. And that probably goes for all the American states. I mean, you know, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. Maybe, you know, Brazil's on the rise, but still not a serious threat, I wouldn't say. So that's what a regional hegemony looks like. It looks like the United States, and that's been the only one, according to Mearsheimer. When he says that other states have tried, think of Germany trying to conquer Europe. Think of Napoleon trying to conquer Europe. And then think of sort of the Soviet Union had serious plans. Actually know somebody who during the Cold War was in the Red Army, and not that he didn't tell me any of the plans, but I mean, from conversations with him, I understood that, you know, there were serious considerations, right? That the Soviet Union might be in Germany one day, right? So that's interesting. You know, there were serious worries that the Soviet Union would try to dominate Europe and become a regional hegemon. And then when I say serious worries, this is really what I'm saying, right? I'm saying that regional hegemons, they try to prevent other regional hegemons arising and thus become status quo powers. So here's the whole game plan there, right? From the United States point of view. They want to be a regional hegemon, which they are, and they want to prevent any other regional hegemons arising. Let's go back to that map. So who might become a regional hegemon? Maybe the Chinese could be a regional hegemon in East Asia, right? So here's the American bases are right next to China. Who else might do it? Maybe Russia in Europe. All right, so well, there's your American troops. So the idea is that any regional hegemon, it wants to maintain its own regional hegemony and then prevent any other states from rising to become regional hegemons in the other regions. So they'll have no peers, no competitors. Okay. And so this is what we're saying. We're saying the US has actively worked to prevent other regional hegemonies. So what does that leave us with then? So this leaves us with an understanding of how international politics works. States are afraid, in order to maintain their relative power and increase their relative power. States want to increase their relative power, and to do so, they will be offensive. The sort of framework in which they'll be offensive is that they'll try to become regional hegemons. China might be trying, maybe Germany's trying, maybe Russia's trying. Germany have certainly tried in the past. Japan has certainly tried in the past. Britain, and we'll see this later on, Britain's not quite, has never really quite tried to dominate Europe. I think it's sort of accepted that it can't really. And it hasn't really made any proper attempt to dominate Europe. But it's usually tried to prevent one other state from dominating Europe, right? Either Germany or France or the Soviet Union. Yeah. In Africa, I can't think of any states that have really tried to become regional hegemons. Yeah. And really, I think Mearsheimer only really talks about Europe and East Asia and the Americas. East Asia, Europe, and North America probably, right? That's most of the wealth, most of the resources, the capital resources, right? They're in those three regions. And so those are the ones that you really want to control, probably, or prevent other people from controlling. So yeah, there we are. And so within this framework of hegemony, regional hegemony, we can't be a global hegemon. We want to be a regional hegemon. Because if we become a regional hegemon, nobody in our region will be able to challenge us. And then we'll have security. And we might be offensive in order to get to that position. And then we're going to be offensive to prevent anybody else getting into that position. All right, that's it. We'll talk more about all of these topics in the next module We're doing a Realism 2 module where we'll talk about power. We'll talk about rational causes of war. We'll talk about Mearsheimer's idea, in particular, of power, sort of military power and how that's used. We'll talk about stopping power of water. Anyway, lots of good things to come in the second module, but hopefully this module has given you some idea, some beginnings of an idea about how realists generally see the world, how they predict international politics, how they make sense of the world, what assumptions they use, and also you should already start to see some of the sort of differences between defensive neoliberalism, offensive neoliberalism, but then also classical realism, expounded by Morgenthau. Okay.